Alright folks, let's get this show on the road. I've had some discussions in the past on how to mount a rifle scope, more of a theoretical thing, and since I had a couple of rifle scopes that I needed to set up a little bit better, I figured this may be a good opportunity to show you a couple of quick and simple methods that I use. It's not rocket science. I think a lot of people do something very similar, and point out a few things to watch out for as I go along. I have two rifle scopes here that you see. This one right here is the primary arms GLX 2.5 to 10 by 44 front focal plane that I received fairly recently, and it's an interesting design. I like scopes like this. I'll do a separate video on it. It also has the primary arms mount that came with the scope. It looks like the same mount that Nikon used to use, and I think I've seen a couple of different iterations of it. It's not my favorite mount overall. I don't like all the skeletonized stuff, but it looks attractive and I think people like it. And this particular one seems to be machined well. At least I'm not seeing anything weird. Another scope I have is the SWF8 2.5 to 10 by 32 ultralight in separate rings, and I'm going to show you as an example how I line this thing up to a sample Picatinny rail. Ordinarily it would be just I use both of these scopes on AR-15s, which is why you see kind of tall mounts. These scopes are pre-set up in the rings, but nothing is tightened, so that I can rotate it and line things up and all that. The way I usually do this, when I do this initial setup, I take a appropriate range, and I mostly these days use stuff from Fix-It Sticks. I've got couple of sets from them, and two different all-in-one torque wrenches. The smaller one and the larger one. Right, this one goes up to 65 inch-pounds, and the smaller one goes up to 25 inch-pounds. I've had this for a while. This one is a new one. I just got it, and I like it quite a bit. So I basically have two fairly complete kits from Fix-It Sticks, and they live in different wrench bags. Right, this one lives in my general purpose wrench bag. This does a lot of stuff, and this, as you see it, lives in one of my in my drag bag in the rifle case, for more of a specialized use just for scopes. This I use for everything, but both are nicely flexible. For the mounting of a rifle scope in an AR type single piece mount, I am going to use the shims, right, to make sure that I line up and rotate the reticle correctly. In order to be able to do that, you have to have a design where there is some sort of flat top surface on the mount. If you're doing on a Picatinny rail, you always have one, and a flat bottom surface on the scope. And these are the two things you are aligning to each other. On a Picatinny rail, I'm going to use another gadget from Fix-It Sticks called the scope jack. Okay. So let's start with the single piece mount. First, before you start really lining things up, etc., I just basically eyeball things and try to tighten the ring cap screws so that the gap on two sides is about the same. Here should be very close. I didn't look at it very hard, something I'm going to need to revisit later anyway. The reason is that if the gap is not as close to identical as you can make it, there will be asymmetrical pressure. The ring halves will be pulled left, right, sideways, kind of potentially, not always, not necessarily, but potentially squeezing the tube in a weird way. It doesn't take much time to do this correctly, so if you're doing it, I might as well do it right. Another thing to figure out is where to position the rings in terms of front and back. I've seen a lot of discussion in terms of where the front ring needs to be, because if your scope has adjustable parallax, and this one does, then depending where it is, if you squeeze it too hard, you might be binding the parallax adjustment. The problem is that in any given scope, you don't really know where is the safe space to squeeze it. So your best bet is to use high quality scope and high quality mount where it is less of a concern. In the case of a scope like this, where it's going to go on AR-15, so in terms of eye relief, it's really not critical where it's going to be. I'm usually going to set it up kind of like this, and about halfway, roughly like this. I scratched it. No, not too much. Roughly like this, for a very simple reason. When I operate the sight focus, I just don't want to run into ring caps. If that gives me problems, for whatever reason, I can later reposition, but for now we'll start like this. For the initial alignment of the reticle, most scopes that have sight focus, something like that, have this little mark here for illumination or sight focus or whatever else. And this is, I'm going to use this and lining it up to the gap in the rings to get my initial orientation. And honestly, I've been doing this long enough where I can usually get things pretty close. Once that is done, I'm going to kind of eyeball what kind of shim spacing I need to get in there, right? Maybe I can squeeze in one more. I'm not trying to make it super tight. I can't. So this is it pretty much. And if the scope is clogged in some weird way, I will not be able to get the shims in there. Okay. Let me see if I can do this better, because I want it to be a little bit tighter. If I go from, usually with different spaced shims, you can get it pretty close. It's never going to be perfect. It's never going to be flawless. There we go. This is pretty good. So, okay. So this will, once you shove it in there carefully without scratching anything, this pretty much lines up the bottom of the turret box, the flat surface there to the flat surface on top of the mount. Okay. Now, and the idea is that you want initially to have it very slightly tight, not so tight that it can't move, but tight enough where if I'm just moving this thing around, nothing flops around. It's really helpful in the future in terms of figuring out, in terms of making sure once you do the alignment that it hasn't shifted on you. And then I'm basically going to hold it and finger tight like this. Gonna go through all four and kind of get them barely tight like this, right? Okay, check the gaps look good, and do the same thing for the front ring. This way, I will switch to the torque wrench momentarily, but in the meantime, by doing it this way, I cannot accidentally over tighten it. If I were to use it as a T-handle, like this, it's very easy to tighten it too much. I don't want to do that until I don't want to apply any torque until I'm using the actual torque wrench. For the ring caps, the manufacturer of the scope is what you should go with, and they will tell you how much torque they recommend. I usually tend to go a little bit lower than what a lot of people do. Partly, but it depends on the rings. For example, these are 4-screw rings, and there's not that much surface, and all this skeletonization makes the ring cap more flexible than I'd like. But if, for example, I have something like the odd mount or something like that, where there are 6 rings 6 screws per ring cap on the front, 4 on the back, I will go a little bit lighter on the one with 6 screws. All of the different torque recommendations from manufacturers assume a conventional ring with 4 screws per cap, like this, that kind of stuff. Okay, I'm going to try to tighten it to about 15 inch-pounds, and the way the all-in-one torque limiter works, and one of the reasons I like it as much as I do, is that I can, with the one torque wrench, without changing any settings, I can just see where it takes me. And I'm going to do it one step at a time. I'm going to get to about 6 or so. I'll go to crisscross pattern. so that I'm gradually tightening it. Okay, and you just keep going until I get to about 12 to 15. It's 10. It's 10. Let's see if I can set it up so you guys can see it a little better. Show on the camera, yes. That's about 10. And that's about 10. Okay, and it's getting pretty tight on both sides. So one of the signs that the ring cap is more flexible than I'd like is when I tighten. There's I have to do this for a while, right? So let's go to 15 now. Okay. Now the gap is very small, but it is still okay. There's still a gap between the ring halves. Okay. All right, so now the front ring is capped. I'm gonna look at it. Sometimes I'll take the shims again and double check to make sure nothing shifted on me. And then you repeat the same exercise for the rear cap. I'm not gonna bore you with this whole thing. I think you get the idea. It's the same basic thing. It does not look any different. Okay. Now, if I am setting up a scope with split rings on a Picatinny rail, this is just a simple, kind of tripod type rail. There are a couple of things you need to do. One thing you need to figure out is the exact spacing between the rings. So for that, I am going to try to put it on a pick rail, and let's say I think it needs to be loosened a little bit. Thankfully, on a typical Picatinny rail, all slots are at about the same distance from each other. And there we go. So now, before I tighten anything with the rings, if these are weaver rings, their recoil lugs are narrower than a typical slot in a Picatinny rail. So for recoil, if you don't want settling, you need to move each ring to the front of the Picatinny slot, and while it's moved that way, you just finger tighten the ring a little bit. Okay, you don't need to tighten it very hard yet. Same business here, right? I'm gonna move this to the front of the Picatinny rail, and I'm gonna finger tighten the lugs. These are TPS rings, so they're tightened a little bit differently than the more conventional ring halves that like I had in a single piece mount. And for this, before you tighten anything else, you need to figure out the eye relief. For this scope, I know that for the AR-15 that this was on, the front ring needs to be about this far from the turret box. It doesn't need to be precise because with the Picatinny rail I can move it front back a little bit. Now let's line up the scope reticle. Once again, I do this enough where I can pretty much do this pretty nicely by just eyeballing it, but it's nice to have tools. And I'm gonna use the Fix-It Sticks scope jack, and this just goes onto a Picatinny rail. Forgive me for it's hard to orient this when you're trying to be in front of the camera. And I just basically finger tighten it to the pick rail. Now, here's what happens. They've got this thing that comes up and contacts the flat surface on the bottom of the scope. And right now, you should be able to see quite clearly that it's not rotated very well. So I am going to reorient it until, let's see if you guys can see this. This makes good contact with the bottom flat surface of the scope, and basically press up a little bit. Experimental. Okay, I think that is almost perfect. There we go. And no, it doesn't hurt to look through the eyepiece of the scope and see if you are visually there. Anyhow, so the scope jack basically makes contact with the bottom flat surface on the scope turret. On this scope, there is not that much of a flat surface, but there is a little bit. You don't see it from this side as well. You can see it a little bit better from here. Okay. Do we still need it? There you go. It looks pretty flat. I'm gonna double check it one more time. It looks all right. Now we can tighten the ring tops. I'm going to do the same business, except with the TPS rings. The way they work, one side needs to be clamped down tightly, and the gap is only on the other side. So on one hand, you don't need to worry about making the gap equal, but on the other hand, when you do this final tightening, the scope can rotate a little bit. So I'll keep the scope jack on there, and so that I can check it later on as we go along. Once you tighten this side, and it can be reasonably tight. I'm not going to go farmer tight on it, but I'm also not going to worry too much about checking torque. Okay, so now on this side there is no gap, and on this side there is a gap, and let's hope I did it on the correct side. Here I am going to use the torque range, and I'm not 100% certain what kind of a torque rating you need for a ring cap like this, but generally going with 15 to 18 inch-pounds is a reasonable idea. You can try to go higher if you need to, if something slips. I tend to be conservative in this, and I stay on the low side. Okay, and the way I'm going to do this, first I'm gonna finger tighten it without the T-handle, so I can't put any excessive torque on it. Once in a while I'm going to revert back to the scope jack and see if anything rotated. No, I think we're still good. So time to now go back to the torque range and tighten this thing, and I'm gonna do the same thing as before. I'm gonna gently go and see how start first go up to 6 inch-pounds, then to, in this case I'm gonna do both rings, then I'm gonna go to 10, if you had more conventional rings where you need gap on both sides, you'd do the same thing as what I did with the single piece mount. First even out the gap and then go in a crisscross pattern. And now I'm going to go up to 15. This particular scope does not have a adjustable parallax, so I don't need to worry about binding that. But it is a variable scope, and it's possible, though not common, to bind the magnification adjustment. So I'm going to move it a little bit. It moves very smoothly. So I think we're good, and I'm going to check the scope jack again to see if anything rotated, and it looks about the same as it looked before, and a quick look through the reticle suggests that nothing shifted. Okay. Now I can remove the scope jack from the rail and put it back where it was. It generally lives in my larger fix-it sticks kit. One of the things that you do afterwards, once this is done, then you take a wrench and basically torque this stuff down to about, usually for the lugs on the rings, usually it is about 65 inch-pounds. Okay. Well, I'm here, so I've bought this kit from Fix-It Sticks, but I've also augmented it a little bit with a couple of things. Gun manufacturers, for some reason, love weird, unusual weird bit sizes, and the two sizes that I needed that did not come with this kit were the 7/64 and 9/64 bits. So I added them in. I also added the Glock front tool sight. Okay, and I bought a AR-15 front blade adjustment, and I keep it in the same basic case together with the Fix-It Sticks, right? And that's where it lives. Okay. So that's how I usually go through the exercise, but like I said, I do this a lot so I can eyeball this thing without any issues. In the end, always check that your parallax and your magnification are not bound, that are not any harder to turn than they were before you set up the scope and the mount. This guy usually has a compact red dot piggybacked on it, so that's gonna go back on now. Okay, and we are officially good to go. 2 scopes lined up and mounted, ready to go on a rifle and be sighted in. If you have any questions, you guys know where to find me. Please subscribe or join, support my channel either on YouTube or at darklordofoptics.com. There will be a link in the description. Thank you very, very much.